Welcome back to Stamps USA, the channel where we explore fascinating American postage stamps, uncover their history, and discover what collectors may be willing to pay for interesting and unusual examples. Today, we are taking a close look at a beautiful vintage United States 1-cent postage stamp featuring the classic Benjamin Franklin design. At first glance, this stamp may look like a simple old 1-cent piece of postage, but stamps from this era can be much more interesting than their tiny face value suggests. The stamp shown here has an ornate design, a large central numeral, the words U.S. postage, and 1 cent, and the kind of intricate engraved appearance that makes early American stamps so fascinating to collectors. The design belongs to the long tradition of American 1-cent Franklin stamps. Benjamin Franklin has an especially important place in U.S. postal history because he was not only one of the country's founding fathers, but also served as an early postmaster. The National Postal Museum notes that Franklin has been one of the most frequently honored Americans on U.S. postage stamps, second only to George Washington. This connection between Franklin and American postal history is one reason Franklin stamps remain such an important area for collectors. One of the most interesting features of this stamp is its highly detailed engraved appearance. The background contains extremely fine geometric and ornamental lines, while the central numeral 1 dominates the design. Around it are the words U.S. postage and 1 cent, with decorative elements filling almost every available space. These details were not simply added for decoration. Early American stamp printers used complex engraving techniques that allowed them to produce incredibly detailed designs while also making counterfeiting more difficult. When you examine an old stamp under magnification, those tiny lines, ornaments, letters, and design details can reveal important information about its printing and variety. The 1-cent denomination was extremely important in American postal history because it was commonly used for low-cost mail. 1-cent stamps could pay certain postcard and other postal rates, and they were also frequently combined with other denominations to meet higher postage rates. For example, the National Postal Museum explains that the 1-cent Franklin was commonly used for the 1-cent card rate and could also be combined with additional stamps for higher rates. This means that although the denomination printed on the stamp was only 1 cent, the stamp itself can carry much more historical significance than its original postal value. Now comes the question that every stamp collector wants answered. How much could a stamp like this actually be worth today? The important thing to understand is that there is no single value for every vintage 1-cent Franklin stamp. Two stamps that look almost identical can have dramatically different values depending on their exact issue, printing, paper, watermark, perforations, condition, gum, cancellation, and variety. In fact, the National Postal Museum explains that 1-cent Franklin issues were produced in numerous versions, with differences involving papers, watermarks, perforations, coils, and other characteristics. Condition is another major factor. Collectors carefully examine the perforations around the edges, the centering of the design, the quality of the printing, the presence of original gum on unused examples, and any damage such as creases, tears, thinning, stains, or repairs. A stamp with strong color, sharp engraving, good centering, intact perforations, and no serious faults can be much more desirable than a heavily damaged example. This is why simply seeing an old stamp and immediately assuming it is worth thousands of dollars can be misleading. The exact identification of a stamp is also extremely important. Early U.S. 1-cent stamps exist in multiple issues and varieties, and some varieties can be distinguished by very small details. Collectors may examine the shape of the ornaments, the outer frame lines, the printing characteristics, paper type, perforation gauge, watermark, and tiny differences in the design. The National Postal Museum specifically describes different 1-cent Franklin printings and notes that some issues contained identifying characteristics associated with particular printing companies and periods. Is where a magnifying glass becomes one of the most useful tools in a stamp collector's collection. If you have an old 1-cent Franklin stamp, don't just look at it with your eyes. Examine the corners, perforations, lettering, frame, central design, and background lines. Look for unusual characteristics and compare them with a reliable U.S. stamp catalog or specialist reference. Sometimes the difference between a common variety and a much scarcer variety can be hidden in a detail that is almost impossible to see without magnification. Another important factor is whether the stamp is unused or used. An unused stamp with original gum can be considerably more desirable than a heavily canceled example, although this varies enormously depending on the particular issue and rarity. A cancellation itself can also sometimes be interesting to specialists if it is unusual, scarce, or connected to an important postal history item. Therefore, collectors should never automatically assume that every cancellation makes a stamp worthless, and there is another reason you should never throw away an old stamp simply because it has a 1-cent denomination. The face value printed on a stamp tells you what it was worth for postage when it was issued, not necessarily what it is worth to collectors today. A stamp originally sold for 1 cent can, in the right variety and condition, become a collectible worth substantially more than its original postal value. At the same time, many common examples remain relatively affordable. So the key is identification rather than denomination alone for the particular stamp shown in this video. The image gives us some useful clues, but a photograph by itself is not enough to guarantee an exact catalog identification or market value. To determine the precise variety, a collector would ideally examine the stamp at high resolution and check its perforation characteristics, paper, watermark if applicable, cancellation or gum, centering, and the tiny design details. This is especially important with older U.S. issues because several visually similar varieties can exist. Some online stamp price guides show that different 1-cent Franklin issues can have very different market prices depending on condition. For example, current dealer and auction-based averages for certain Franklin issues range from modest amounts for common used examples to significantly higher prices for better quality unused examples. But these figures should only be treated as rough guides, not as a guaranteed selling price. Actual auction results can vary considerably depending on rarity, certification, condition, provenance, and collector demand. If you have a stamp like this in your own collection, there are several things you should do before trying to sell it. First, avoid cleaning it or attempting to remove marks. Never use chemicals, water, adhesive removers, or household cleaning products. Second, handle the stamp carefully and preferably use stamp tongs rather than your fingers. Third, photograph both the front and back in good lighting. The back can be just as important as the front because gum, hinges, thinning, paper characteristics, and watermarks can help identify the issue. And most importantly, don't judge the value based solely on an internet listing where someone has placed a huge asking price on a stamp. An asking price is not necessarily the same thing as a completed sale. For valuable stamps, collectors and dealers generally look for documented auction results, established catalog references, expert opinions, and certification when appropriate. What makes stamps like this so fascinating is that they combine art, technology, history, and everyday life. This tiny piece of engraved paper was once part of the American postal system. It could have traveled on a postcard, letter, business document, or other piece of mail many decades ago. Today, it can become an object of study for collectors who want to understand exactly when it was produced, where it was printed, how it was used, and why particular varieties became scarce. So, could this 1-cent Franklin stamp be worth big money? Possibly, but the exact answer depends on the precise variety and condition. The most valuable lesson for collectors is not to assume that every old stamp is rare, but also not to assume that an ordinary-looking stamp has no value. The real opportunity comes from learning how to recognize the differences between issues and varieties. If you have an old U.S. stamp collection sitting in an album, envelope, box, or inherited collection, take another look before you put it away. Check the small details. Check the perforations. Check the paper. Check the watermark when applicable. Look for unusual varieties. And most importantly, research the exact stamp. Rather than judging it only by its age or face value, this beautiful 1-cent Franklin is a perfect reminder that the smallest pieces of paper can preserve some of the biggest stories in American history. And sometimes, the difference between an ordinary stamp and a highly desirable collectible can be hidden in details that are almost invisible to the naked eye. Next up, we're taking a close look at this striking 15-cent John J. U.S. postage stamp featuring one of the most important figures from the early history of the United States. At first glance, it may look like a simple vintage stamp, but this small piece of engraved paper represents an important chapter in American political, legal, and postal history. The man pictured on the stamp is John Jay, one of the founding fathers of the United States and the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. J played a major role during the creation of the new American government and was also deeply involved in diplomacy. His portrait makes this stamp particularly interesting because it connects American postal history with the country's earliest years as an independent nation. The stamp shown here has a 15-cent denomination and uses a rich reddish-brown or dark carmine appearance. The portrait of John Jay dominates the center, while the words John Jay appear beside his portrait. At the bottom, the denomination 15 and the words U.S. Postage clearly identify it as an American postage stamp. The engraved portrait and fine background lines give the stamp a classic appearance that collectors of older U.S. postage often appreciate. John Jay himself had an extraordinary career. Born in New York in 1745, he became a lawyer, diplomat, statesman, and one of the most influential figures in the early American Republic. He served as the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court from 1789 to 1795. Before and during the Revolutionary era, Jay also participated in important diplomatic efforts and helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the American Revolutionary War. That history gives the stamp more than just visual appeal. When collectors study a stamp featuring a historical figure like John Jay, they are also holding a small reminder of the political and institutional foundations of the United States. Every detail on the stamp, the portrait, typography, frame, denomination, and engraving was designed to communicate both authority and historical significance. One of the first things collectors should examine on a stamp like this is its condition. The perforations around the edges should be checked carefully. Are they complete and clean, or are there missing, short, or damaged perforations? Is the stamp well centered within the perforated edges? Are there creases, tears, thinning, stains, or other faults? These details can have a major impact on collector interest and market value. The quality of the printing is also important. Look closely at the portrait and the fine engraved lines in the background. On a well-preserved example, these details should remain clear and sharp. Collectors may also compare the color with known examples because color varieties and changes caused by storage or exposure can sometimes be important when identifying older stamps. Another major factor is whether the stamp is mint or used. An unused stamp may retain original gum on the back, while a used stamp will normally have a cancellation showing that it traveled through the postal system. Neither condition is automatically better in every situation. The desirability depends on the exact issue, rarity, condition, and what collectors are currently seeking, and this is where things become particularly interesting. A stamp's printed denomination does not automatically determine its collector value today. A 15-cent stamp was originally worth 15 cents for postage, but its collectible value can be different, depending on the exact issue and condition. Some vintage stamps are worth only a modest amount, while scarce varieties, exceptional condition examples, or important postal history pieces can command much higher prices. However, it is very important not to assume that every old-looking John Jay stamp is automatically worth thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. The exact identification must come first. Collectors should determine the stamp's issue, year, printing method, paper, perforation characteristics, and other identifying features before attempting to estimate a value. A magnifying glass can be extremely useful here. Look carefully at the portrait, the lettering, the frame, the corners, and the perforations. Small differences that are difficult to see with the naked eye can sometimes help distinguish one variety from another. Serious collectors often use specialized catalogs and comparison images to determine exactly which stamp they have. The back of the stamp is equally important. If you own a similar example, don't focus only on the attractive portrait on the front. Turn it over and examine the paper and gum. Look for hinges, mounting marks, thinning, or other damage. Some identification characteristics may also be visible from the back, and the condition of the reverse can significantly influence the stamp's desirability. Another important lesson for anyone discovering an old collection is to avoid altering the stamp. Never try to wash, clean, bleach, flatten, or repair an old stamp yourself. Even an attempted improvement can damage the paper or reduce its collector value. If a stamp appears particularly rare or valuable, professional evaluation and certification may be worthwhile. The history behind John Jay also makes this stamp especially fascinating. Jay was not simply a name chosen for a postage design. He was deeply connected to the formation of the American government and the development of the country's legal system. As the first Chief Justice of the United States, His legacy is closely connected with the beginning of the Supreme Court and the new constitutional government. Imagine this tiny stamp traveling through the American postal system decades ago. It may have been attached to a letter carrying news between families, businesses, government offices, or communities. The letter eventually disappeared, but the stamp survived. Today, that small piece of paper can provide collectors with a tangible connection to American history for collectors. This is one of the greatest attractions of classic U.S. postage. A stamp is not simply a piece of paper with a denomination printed on it. It can be a miniature historical artifact. It can tell us who was considered important enough to appear on national postage, how stamps were manufactured, what postal rates existed at the time, and how American society and government evolved. So, could this 15-cent John Jay stamp be valuable? The honest answer is that the photograph alone isn't enough to assign a reliable market price. Its exact catalog identification and physical condition need to be confirmed first. The most important things to investigate are the issue, perforations, centering, color, gum or cancellation, paper characteristics, and any unusual varieties or flaws. If you discover one of these stamps in an inherited collection, an old album, or a box of vintage correspondence, don't immediately dismiss it because of its 15-cent denomination. Take a closer look. Compare it with reputable catalog references. Examine the perforations and design under magnification. Check the back. And if something looks unusual, consider having it examined by a knowledgeable U.S. stamp specialist. The story of this John Jay stamp is a perfect example of why stamp collecting can be so rewarding. A tiny object can combine American history, politics, law, engraving, printing technology, and postal history all in one design. And while not every example will be rare or extremely valuable, discovering exactly what you have is part of the excitement. So before you throw an old stamp into a box or overlook it in an inherited album, remember that the real value may be hidden in the details. That small portrait of John Jay could be more than just an old piece of postage. It could be a fascinating piece of American history waiting to be identified. Next up, we're looking at a beautiful 1-cent Benjamin Franklin U.S. postage stamp. At first glance, it may appear to be a simple green 1-cent stamp, but its classic design, historical connection to Benjamin Franklin, and distinctive engraved appearance make it a fascinating piece of American postal history. The first thing that immediately catches your attention is the portrait of Benjamin Franklin in the center. Franklin is shown in profile, facing left, surrounded by an elaborate ornamental frame. Above the portrait are the words United States Postage, while the bottom prominently displays 1 cent. The name Franklin appears beneath the portrait. The large numeral 1 on both lower corners makes the denomination easy to recognize. Benjamin Franklin is one of the most famous figures in American history, and his connection to the postal system goes far beyond appearing on postage stamps. Franklin served as a postmaster and played an important role in the development of colonial postal services. Because of this connection, his portrait became one of the most recognizable images in American philately. Franklin stamps have been issued in many different designs and denominations throughout U.S. postal history. What makes this particular design especially attractive is the incredible amount of detail packed into such a small piece of paper. The portrait contains fine engraved lines, while the surrounding frame includes intricate geometric patterns and decorative scrollwork. When viewed under magnification, these details become even more impressive. This kind of engraving required considerable skill and precision, and it is one of the reasons collectors enjoy examining classic American stamps closely. But now comes the question that many viewers are probably asking: how much could a 1-cent Franklin stamp like this be worth today? The answer isn't as simple as looking at the number printed on the stamp. The fact that it says 1 cent doesn't mean the stamp is worth only 1 cent today, but it also doesn't automatically mean that it is worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. The real collectible value depends on the exact issue, variety, condition, centering, perforations, gum, cancellation, and rarity. This is one of the most important lessons in stamp collecting. Many U.S. stamps have similar designs, but they can belong to completely different issues. Small differences in printing, paper, perforation, watermark, color, or design can help identify the exact stamp. Some varieties are extremely common, while others can be considerably scarcer. So if you have a similar 1-cent Franklin in your collection, the first step should be identification. Don't immediately search for 1-cent Franklin stamp value and assume the first price you see applies to your stamp. Instead, try to determine the exact issue and catalog number. A magnifying glass can be extremely helpful. Start by examining the perforations around the edges. Are they complete and evenly formed? Are any perforations short or damaged? Next, look at the centering. Is the design positioned evenly inside the perforated edges, or is it noticeably shifted toward one side? Centering can make a significant difference for some issues. Then examine the printing itself. Look closely at Franklin's portrait, the lettering, the frame, and the ornamental details. The fine lines should be carefully compared with reference images from a reliable stamp catalog. Sometimes a tiny difference that looks insignificant to someone unfamiliar with stamps can be an important identifying characteristic to an experienced collector. The back of the stamp is equally important. If this is an unused stamp, collectors may examine the gum and look for evidence of previous mounting or hinges. If it is used, the cancellation can provide information about how the stamp was used and sometimes its postal history interest. You should also check for thinning, creases, tears, stains, or repairs. Condition is one of the biggest factors affecting collectible value. A stamp with strong color, clear printing, intact perforations, good centering, and no major faults will generally be more desirable than a damaged example of the same issue. Even a small crease or tear can have a substantial impact on the market value of a collectible stamp. Another thing collectors should remember is that age alone does not determine value. An extremely old stamp can be common and relatively inexpensive, while a less ancient stamp can be scarce and highly desirable. What matters is the combination of rarity, condition, demand, and the exact variety. The green color of this stamp also gives it a very distinctive appearance. Classic U.S. stamps were produced in a wide range of colors, and collectors often pay close attention to color because different printings or issues can sometimes be distinguished by their shades. However, color can also change because of aging, storage conditions, exposure to light, or chemicals. So it should be evaluated carefully. If you inherited an old stamp collection containing Franklin stamps, don't throw anything away simply because the stamps look ordinary. Old albums, envelopes, and even pieces of correspondence can contain important clues. A stamp attached to an original envelope, for example, may have postal history significance that would be lost if the stamp were removed, and never attempt to clean or repair an old stamp yourself. Don't wash it, bleach it, iron it, or try to remove adhesive with household chemicals. Amateur repairs can permanently damage the stamp and may significantly reduce its collector value. One of the most exciting aspects of stamp collecting is the possibility of discovering a variety that other people overlooked. The stamp may look almost identical to another example, but its paper, perforations, printing characteristics, or other details could make it a completely different catalog variety. However, it's important to keep expectations realistic. Not every 1-cent Franklin stamp is a hidden fortune. Many examples are common and can be purchased by collectors for relatively modest prices. The goal isn't simply to find an old stamp and declare it valuable. The goal is to identify exactly what you have and understand why collectors value it. For the stamp shown in this video, the photograph gives us enough information to recognize the basic design and denomination. But a photograph alone is not sufficient to provide a guaranteed market value. A professional identification would require examination of the stamp's physical characteristics and comparison with specialized U.S. stamp references. If you have this type of Franklin stamp at home, take a clear photograph of both sides and carefully record its condition. Look at the perforations, centering, color, gum, cancellation, and any unusual markings. Then compare those characteristics with a trusted catalog. If the stamp appears to be a scarce variety or is in exceptional condition, professional authentication may be worth considering. And think about what this tiny piece of paper represents. Benjamin Franklin was not simply a famous face placed on American postage. He was deeply connected to the development of the postal system itself. When you hold a Franklin stamp, you're holding a small object that connects American postal history with one of the country's most influential founding fathers. That is what makes collecting old U.S. stamps so fascinating. Behind every design is a story. Behind every denomination is a piece of postal history. And behind some seemingly ordinary stamps are varieties that can take careful research to identify. So, could your 1-cent Franklin stamp be worth more than 1 cent? Absolutely, but the exact answer depends on what specific stamp you have. Don't judge it only by its face value or appearance. Examine the details, identify the issue, Check the condition and research reliable market information before making any assumptions about its value. If you enjoyed today's exploration, make sure to subscribe to Stamps USA for more videos about rare U.S. stamps, vintage postage, hidden varieties, historical figures, and fascinating pieces of American postal history. And remember, the next time you see an old 1-cent stamp sitting inside a forgotten album, don't overlook it. That tiny piece of paper could be carrying a much bigger story than you expect.